I've kept this particular matter private for so long that I am no longer entirely certain I remember how to speak of it plainly. There are things a person guards so carefully for so many years that they cease to feel like secrets in the ordinary sense. They do not throb like fresh wounds. They do not even ache consistently. They harden. They settle. They become structural, like a beam laid quietly into the frame of a house, bearing weight without announcement. After sufficient time has passed, you do not regard it as something you carry. You regard it as something you are. And then, at the end of your life, someone asks you to account for yourself before you depart it. And you discover that what has long felt immovable must at last be lifted and examined in the light. So I will set it down as accurately as I am able. I was born on the 4th of September, 1851, on a farm in Vigo County, Indiana, land my father had purchased 3 years earlier with money accumulated through patience and an almost stubborn devotion to labor. My father was Elias Whitmore, Scotch-Irish in origin and temperament, spare in speech, exacting in work, and suspicious of any gain that arrived without visible effort attached to it. He believed comfort must be earned, or it would corrupt the character of the one who received it. I did not always understand him while he lived. I understand him better now. Hardship clarifies the nature of those who raised you. I have had sufficient hardship in my years to see my father more clearly than I did when I was young and impatient with his reserve. My mother, Catherine Anne, French blood through her father, carried warmth in her manner that balanced my father's severity. The darkness of her hair and the particular cast of her features distinguished her subtly in a county largely peopled by similar stock. She managed our household with brisk competence, rising before dawn, retiring after the last lamp was extinguished, and conducting the endless operations of farm life with a steadiness that, in later years, I have come to regard as a quiet species of heroism. Women of her generation would not have named it so. They would simply have called it duty. There were 5 children born to our family, though only 4 of us reached adulthood. My eldest brother Daniel was born in 1845. I followed in 1851. Thomas came in 1854, and my sister Clara in 1857. Between Thomas and Clara there had been another, a boy named Franklin, born in the winter of 1860, who lived 11 days before succumbing to an illness that moved through the county that season with little discrimination. My mother kept a small likeness of Franklin tucked into her Bible, placed behind the front board where most families stored records of births and burials. I remember seeing her fingers rest there on certain evenings when she believed herself unobserved. She did not speak his name to us often. Grief in that era was conducted quietly, almost privately to the point of invisibility. The world was expected to proceed without outward accommodation for absence. Our farm comprised 80 acres, of which my father cultivated perhaps 55 in corn and wheat. There was a kitchen garden that belonged in spirit and in governance to my mother. She defended it with a tenacity she applied to few other things. We kept 2 draft horses, Samson and his more compliant companion, whose name escapes me now, though I recall his temperament distinctly, a milk cow, a dozen hogs, and chickens that multiplied and diminished with seasonal indifference. The house was a framed structure of modest ambition, larger perhaps than our finances strictly warranted. There was a parlor used only when visitors of consequence arrived, which occurred perhaps twice yearly, and 3 rooms upstairs that accommodated 6 bodies through the sort of arrangement necessity devises when architecture is secondary to survival. Winters in Vigo County were stern enough to command respect, but not so brutal as to inspire the competitive pride I later heard from those farther north. Summers demanded labor from every able body, regardless of age. I attended the common school from the age of 7 until I was perhaps 14, though not continuously. The school term lasted only 3 or 4 months each year, and planting and harvest required every pair of hands the farm could claim. The schoolhouse was a single room serving children of varying ages under teachers whose tenure was often brief. Instruction varied accordingly. I learned to read with competence and to write a clear, serviceable hand. I developed an enthusiasm for books that my father regarded with mild suspicion. He was not opposed to literacy, far from it, but he believed any reading not directly connected to scripture or agricultural management edged dangerously toward idleness. My mother entertained no such reservations. She kept a small shelf of books in the kitchen, and I read them repeatedly until their contents felt more familiar than the expressions of certain neighbors. The war commenced when I was 9 years old. At first it existed as agitation in men's voices at the store, and as narrow columns in the county paper. A child of 9 does not immediately grasp what war means. The comprehension arrives swiftly. By the autumn of 1861, Daniel had enlisted. He was 16. His first attempt was refused on account of his youth. He returned the following spring with greater determination, and was accepted into an Indiana infantry regiment. He wrote letters from Tennessee describing landscapes so foreign to my imagination that I struggled to believe they belonged to the same nation as our fields. The county endured losses as all counties did. There were men who returned and men who did not. 3 families within a mile of our farm lost sons. 2 were killed in the same engagement in Georgia in 1864. I never fully understood the particulars of that battle, but I understood its consequence. Mrs. Henderson, who had once been brisk and opinionated, took to her bed for weeks. When she rose again, something in her countenance remained altered, a vacancy where animation had once lived. My father made no public declarations about the war. He rose earlier, he worked longer. Labor was his chosen answer to affliction. Daniel returned in the spring of 1865 with his limbs intact, which was counted a blessing. Yet he was changed. He had grown quieter. There was a vigilance in him, as though he were perpetually assessing whether what stood before him constituted a threat. He did not speak of what he had witnessed. We did not ask. It was in the years following the war, 1866 and 1867, that the matter I have undertaken to disclose became part of my existence. I was 15, then 16. There was a young man in the county named Eli Fletcher, son of a farming family whose land lay perhaps 3 miles from ours. He had enlisted underage in 1863, lied convincingly about his years, and returned in 1864 with a wound to his right shoulder that left his arm permanently weakened. What the war had deposited into him at so young an age was not easily contained. I will not make him a villain. That would be inaccurate. He was damaged. He was charming. He possessed a disregard for convention that, to a 16-year-old girl who had known only fields and restraint, appeared dangerously like freedom. He was handsome, dark eyes, quick expression, a recklessness I mistook for courage. I was not entirely foolish, but I was 16, and there is a species of wisdom unavailable until one has paid for it. We kept company for perhaps 5 months, though that phrase suggests a formality our meetings did not possess. They were stolen conversations at the far edges of property lines, encounters arranged to resemble coincidence. By November of 1867, I knew I was carrying a child. I cannot supply language sufficient to convey what that realization meant to a 16-year-old farm girl in rural Indiana in 1867. Even at 79, with decades to refine my understanding, I lack the vocabulary to render it fully. I will say only that it was a period of extremity. When I told Eli, he listened in silence for nearly a minute. Then he informed me he had been considering relocation to Missouri, where a cousin required assistance on a farm. He departed within the month. I saw him once more on the county road before he left. He looked at me across a distance I cannot now measure with accuracy. There was something in his expression I have never deciphered. Then he continued on. I never saw him again. I never received a letter. I never wrote one. In time I ceased to speculate about his fate. My mother discovered my condition in January of 1868. I had concealed it for approximately 2 months, which in a household governed by her attentiveness was no small accomplishment. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. She sat with me at the kitchen table for nearly an hour. Then she made a decision. It was a decision made without consultation with my father. and it was a decision that altered the entire course of my life. My mother's decision was made with the kind of quiet authority women of that era were required to exercise in circumstances the acknowledged head of the household would have handled poorly, or too publicly, or with consequences that could not be undone. I was to be sent to my Aunt Ruth in Decatur, Illinois. Ruth was my mother's elder sister, married to a cooper named Ambrose Cady. They lived in town rather than on a farm in a modest but orderly house and had 2 young children. The explanation offered to the community was that Ruth had been suffering from a lingering chest complaint and required assistance with her household. It was plausible. It was unremarkable. It invited no further inquiry. I departed in late February of 1868 by train, my first extended journey by rail. Under different conditions, I might have found the experience astonishing. The speed, the noise, the sensation of being carried across distance without visible exertion, these would have occupied my full attention. As it was, I remember very little of that journey. I recall only a persistent sense that I was being conveyed out of one life and into another, without the certainty of returning unchanged. My aunt received me without ceremony. There was no need for elaborate acknowledgment. She understood. I understood that she understood. The practical kindness she extended required no namming. The child was born in the middle of April, 1868. A girl. I held her for approximately 2 hours. She was strong and well-formed, dark hair already visible against her small head, her eyes unfocused in the manner of all newborns. Yet there was something in the arrangement of her features that struck me immediately as familiar. Whether that impression was accurate or merely the invention of an overwhelmed 16-year-old, I cannot say with certainty even now. My aunt had arranged, through correspondence conducted before my arrival, for the infant to be received by a farming couple in the county who had lost 2 children of their own and had not succeeded in raising any to adulthood. I was told they were respectable people, with sufficient means and a reputation for steadiness. I was told the child would be properly cared for. I was not asked whether I consented. I do not record that as accusation. It simply was not the structure within which such matters were managed. On the evening before I departed Decatur to return home, my aunt informed me that the child had taken fever within 3 weeks of her birth and had died. She had been buried in the county cemetery. That was the account provided. It was delivered with gentleness and with finality. I did not believe it. I had no evidence, then or since, to prove the account false. Infant mortality in 1868 was common. Fever did not require explanation. It was entirely possible that what I had been told was accurate in every particular. And yet I did not believe it. I believed my mother and my aunt, both practical women with limited tolerance for prolonged suffering, had chosen to provide me with a grief that was finite. A death is terrible, but it concludes a matter. A living child surrendered to anonymity does not conclude. It extends indefinitely. I believed they had elected mercy as they understood it. I have believed for 63 years that the child lived. I returned to Indiana in late May of 1868. I was 17 years old. My father was told only that I had assisted my aunt through a difficult confinement and subsequent illness. He received this explanation without visible skepticism. If he harbored questions, he managed them privately. Life resumed its rhythms. There is a peculiar mercy in farm labor. It does not accommodate prolonged introspection. The fields require attention whether one's interior world is orderly or shattered. I rose at dawn. I worked through planting and harvest. I resumed my place at the table. But I was not the same girl who had departed in February. One does not leave as a daughter and return as a mother, however briefly, and remain unchanged. Still, the farm required what it required, and I was not afforded the luxury of visible collapse. In February of 1871, when I was 19 years old and approaching 20, I married James Caldwell. This was slightly later than customary in our community. My mother explained, when explanation was solicited, that I had been occupied with family obligations and had not participated much in social gatherings in recent years. The explanation was not untrue. I met James at a harvest gathering in the autumn of 1870. He was 24, the second son of a Vigo County family, deliberate in speech, measured in judgment, possessed of a dry humor that revealed itself infrequently enough to retain its force. He was not reckless. He did not unsettle a room. He was solid. By 19, I had learned to value solidity above all other virtues. We married on the 14th of February, 1871, a date later romanticized by my children, though in truth it was selected because it suited the schedules of our families. Before I proceed, I will be plain on one point. I was a faithful wife to James Caldwell for 42 years, until his death in 1913. I was faithful in conduct and in intention. I was present in our shared life. I held nothing back from him that bore upon our farm, our finances, or the raising of our children. Except this, he married a woman who had already borne a child, and he did not know it. That omission was the single unfaithfulness of my marriage. We had 7 children. Robert was born in 1872, Alina in 1874, Arthur in 1876. He lived 3 months before congestion of the lungs carried him away. Margaret followed in 1878. Clara Jane in 1880, named carefully to avoid confusion with my sister Clara, though confusion persisted regardless. William in 1882, and Edward in 1884. Of those 7, 5 reached adulthood. Arthur died in infancy. Edward died in the autumn of 1890 at 6 years of age, of diphtheria. Edward's death did not settle into memory as other griefs had done. It remained sharp, separate. He had been a perceptive child, given to observation, so direct they unsettled adults who preferred certain truths unspoken. I have often wondered what manner of man he would have become. I no longer pursue that line of thought deliberately. It arrives without invitation often enough. The years of our marriage were, in most respects, ordinary for our time and place. We moved to the larger Caldwell farm in 1880 after James's father died. In 1883 we built a new house, an undertaking James supervised with almost scholarly attention to timber and joinery. That house still stands. It is where I now sit. The railroad had arrived in our county by 1876. Telephones appeared in the county seat in the 1890s. Electricity followed in town near the turn of the century. The world my children inhabited was already different from the one into which I had been born. On the last evening of 1899, James and I sat on the porch and watched the fading light. I was 48 years old. I considered the transformation I had witnessed. Rail lines, telegraph wires, mail-order catalogues delivering goods my mother would have traveled miles to obtain. James said he expected 1900 to resemble 1899 in all essential respects. I suspected he underestimated the speed of change. Throughout all those years, the births, the deaths, the harvests, the steady accumulation of ordinary days, the child I surrendered in April of 1868 remained present to me. Not as a spectre, not as a daily torment, but as a constant knowledge. Somewhere in Illinois, I believed, there lived a person who had come from my body, whose name I did not know, whose face I could not conjure with certainty, but whose existence I never doubted. There were mornings when I would be engaged in an ordinary task, churning butter, hanging laundry, and the arithmetic would arrive quietly. She is 7 now. She is 12. She is 16 and perhaps restless. She would have been 2 when I married James, 12 when Arthur was born and died, 22 when Edward fell ill, 31 when we built the new house. I could not verify her life, but I counted it faithfully. In the summer of 1893, I attempted inquiry. For 25 years I had refrained, believing any answer would present difficulty. Confirmation of death would require me to accept what I did not believe. Confirmation of life would confront me with a circumstance I had no means of navigating. Still, I wrote to my cousin Helen, Aunt Ruth's eldest daughter, as Ruth herself had died in 1884. I phrased my question with care. asking whether she recalled any arrangement in 1868 involving an infant girl placed with a farming family. Her reply was cordial, brief, entirely uninformative. She remembered no such arrangement. She inquired after my children by name. I did not write again. I believe she understood precisely what I had asked, and had been instructed long ago to maintain silence. That was my answer. There was one occasion, though I cannot attest to its significance with complete confidence, when I believe I may have seen her. It was the summer of 1903. James wished to examine certain agricultural implements being demonstrated at a county fair in the neighboring county. I accompanied him, as I occasionally did when distance and weather permitted. In the late afternoon, I was walking the exhibition grounds with my daughter Alina, when I noticed a woman standing some 20 yards away. She appeared to be in her middle 30s. She stood beside a man I assumed to be her husband, and 2 children, perhaps 6 and 8 years of age, were running in the grass before her. She turned her head to say something to the man. It was only a profile, only a moment, and yet something in the angle of her cheek, the line of her brow, arrested me so completely that I stopped mid-step. Alina asked whether I felt unwell. I told her the heat had affected me. We continued walking. I cannot state with certainty that the woman I observed was the child I bore in April of 1868. The correspondence of age was approximate. She might have been younger. She might have been older. Human estimation at a distance is unreliable. I saw her for perhaps 5 seconds. But I have returned to that 5-second image thousands of times in the 28 years since. And I am 79 years old. There are certain allowances one earns at this age, in the matter of what one chooses to believe. I told James in February of 1911. The decision was not sudden. It had formed slowly over several years, growing more insistent as James's health began to decline. He was 64 then. His heart troubled him, not dramatically but persistently. His physician spoke in careful generalities, suggesting gravity without committing to a timetable. I could not know whether James would live another month or another decade. But I had observed my own father die without knowledge of certain matters that might have altered his understanding of his children had he known them earlier. I did not wish to deprive James in the same manner. I chose a Sunday evening. The children were grown and maintaining households of their own. James and I sat alone in the parlor. He was reading the county paper in the chair he had occupied for 3 decades, holding it at its habitual distance, lips moving slightly when an item merited reflection. I told him there was something I had never disclosed, that it pertained to the time before our marriage, and that I had withheld it not from indifference, but from fear, whose precise nature I struggled to articulate. He set the paper down on his knee, and looked at me with what I recognized as his listening expression, attentive, composed, free of immediate judgment. I told him everything. I spoke for 35 or perhaps 40 minutes. I told him about Eli Fletcher, about Decatur, about the child, about my disbelief in the reported fever, about the letter to Helen, about the woman at the fair, about the arithmetic I had performed for 40 years in silence. At certain points my voice failed me. When I finished, James did not speak for what I calculate to have been 5 minutes. He sat entirely still, hands resting on the folded paper, eyes directed somewhere just below my face, the posture he adopted when thinking with full attention. Then he said, and I have repeated these words often enough in memory to know them precisely, "Harriet, how long have you been carrying that?" It was not accusation. It was not astonishment. It was recognition. I told him since before we were married. He nodded once. Then he lifted the paper and resumed reading. We did not speak further that evening. In the 2 years that remained to him, the subject arose only twice more. The first time, perhaps a month later, he asked whether I wished to attempt to find the child. I told him I did not know. That remains true. He said that if I decided to pursue such a course, he would not oppose it. The second time was in the spring of 1913, 3 weeks before he died. He was confined to bed by then. His heart no longer permitted sustained effort. I was sitting beside him in the afternoon, after a long and companionable silence, the kind that settles naturally between 2 people who have shared 40 years. He reached for my hand. Deliberately. He held it for a considerable time. He said nothing. Then he slept. In the 17 years since his death, I have asked myself whether that gesture was sufficient. I believe it was. He died on the 7th of August, 1913. He was 67 years old. We had been married 42 years and some months. My children know nothing of this matter. Robert is 59 this year. Elena is 56, Margaret 53, Clara Jane 51, William 49. None of them know there was a child born in April of 1868 in Decatur, Illinois. Whether they should be told is a question I have never fully resolved. If she lived, she would be 63 now. There is a woman somewhere, perhaps, who does not know that her mother sits in Indiana counting her years. She may know she was adopted. She may believe her mother died of fever. She may know nothing at all. The Great War took my grandson Charles in 1917. He was 21 in France. The particulars of his death were never entirely clear. Robert did not press for details beyond a certain point. I understood that restraint. By then, I had lived long enough to recognize the century's capacity for repetition in sorrow. I have thought often about what it means to keep a secret for 40 years. At first one believes it to be a contained thing, an omission carefully preserved. But a secret of that magnitude does not remain confined. It permeates. It sits at the dinner table. It lies beside you in bed. It attends church. It watches over your children when they are ill. It is not always painful, but it is never absent. And I believe, though I cannot prove, that a woman altered by such long carrying is not the same woman she would have been had she laid the burden down earlier. Not worse, not necessarily diminished, but shaped her. My sister Clara died in 1919. Thomas followed in 1924. Daniel, who had returned from the Civil War altered but unbroken, outlived them both and died in 1927. That seemed fitting to me. He had spent the greater portion of his adult life outlasting things that might reasonably have finished him. My father died in 1891. My mother in 1902 at 81 years of age. She retained faculties almost to the end, which I count as a mercy. She died in the house she had kept for 40 years, another mercy, and I was with her when she passed, which is one of the few acts in my life I feel I managed precisely as I ought. I have wondered over the years whether my mother kept the secret of my confinement, and the child's placement for my protection or for her own. Age grants a certain patience in evaluating one's parents. I believe now the answer is both. She understood clearly the arithmetic of reputation in an 1868 rural Indiana community. A young woman with a child born out of wedlock would not have been judged with nuance. My mother calculated carefully. She weighed my future against the risk of exposure. She chose concealment. But she also chose peace for herself, an orderly resolution rather than an open wound within her household. I no longer resent her for that. Resentment requires energy better spent elsewhere, and I exhausted my supply of it long ago. There is another consideration I will record, since I have committed myself to completeness. I have wondered, more often than I admit, whether the woman I glimpsed in 1903, if indeed she was the child I bore, was content in her life, whether the couple who raised her were kind beyond mere decency, whether she learned to read as I did, whether she married a man of steadiness, or one of charm and restlessness, whether she bore children, and if so, whether she kept small mementos tucked behind the front board of her Bible. These speculations are not pleasant, but they are honest. I am 79 years old. I have lived in one county in Indiana my entire life. I have managed crops through drought and abundance. I have raised 5 children to adulthood. I have buried 2 sons and a husband. I have witnessed the arrival of the railroad, the telephone, electric light, the automobile. The automobile reached our county around 1905. By 1925, my grandchildren regarded it as unremarkable. I have ridden in one. I found the sensation disagreeable in detail and astonishing in principle, an appropriate response, I think, to most of the century's innovations. The world into which I was born in 1851 no longer exists in any recognizable form. Yet here I remain, seated in a cane-backed chair in the house James built, speaking into a recording apparatus that would have seemed sorcery in my childhood. If the child I surrendered in April of 1868 lives still, she is 63 years of age. She does not know that her mother sits in Indiana and has counted her years with unfailing precision. She does not know that at every significant juncture of my life, I paused to calculate her corresponding age. When Robert married, she would have been 20. When Edward died, she would have been 22. When the new house was completed, she would have been 31. When James passed, she would have been 45. The arithmetic never ceased. I did not dwell in sorrow daily. I did not neglect my duties. But the counting persisted as steady as breathing. I cannot reach her. I do not know her name. I do not know whether she lives in Illinois still, or whether she traveled west, or north, or farther than I can imagine. I do not know whether she resembles me as I am now, or as I was at 16. I know only that I held her for 2 hours, and that I have never entirely relinquished her in my mind. I have been asked in these later years whether I regret not searching for her more vigorously. It is a question that appears straightforward, but is not. In 1868, there were no agencies as there are now, no formal records readily accessible to a woman in my position. Any inquiry would have required reopening matters my mother had closed deliberately. It would have required public acknowledgment. It would have altered the standing of my husband and my children in ways I could not predict or control. And so I chose, repeatedly, not to disturb what had been arranged. That choice made first in fear became over time a habit hardened into structure. There are moments when I imagine what might have occurred had I written more letters, had I traveled to Decatur unannounced, had I pressed my cousin beyond courtesy. It is possible I would have discovered a grave bearing the date of 1868, and been forced to accept what I never believed. It is equally possible I would have found a woman who regarded me as an intrusion rather than a deliverance. There is no version of that search guaranteed to conclude in restoration. And so I remained where I was, wife, mother, farmer's daughter grown into farmer's wife, carrying the knowledge quietly. A secret of 40 years alters the texture of one's interior life. It teaches restraint. It cultivates a discipline of speech. It deepens certain sympathies and complicates certain joys. When my daughters came to me with small transgressions in their youth, I measured my response carefully, aware that I had once stood at the edge of a far more consequential misstep. I do not claim virtue in this. I claim only endurance. If she lives, she may have passed through her own seasons of joy and grief, without once suspecting that her first mother measured those seasons from afar. She may have known happiness unshadowed by questions of origin. If that is so, I am content to have been absent from her knowledge. Love does not always require proximity. Sometimes it requires restraint. When James asked me, "How long have you been carrying that?" he named something essential. The carrying itself became the shape of my fidelity, not only to him, but to the life that unfolded after 1868. I did not allow the secret to sour my marriage. I did not allow it to diminish my attention to the children I raised. I kept faith with the life before me, even as I acknowledged the life beyond my reach. Now I am near the end of my years. My hands are thinner than they were. My hearing is imperfect. The world moves at a pace I no longer attempt to follow, yet the arithmetic remains clear. 63 years, 63 birthdays imagined, 63 winters considered. If she has children, they would be grown now. If she has grandchildren, they may be near the age I was when the war began. Time extends without regard for the secrets folded inside it. I do not know whether setting this down changes anything. It does not alter the past. It does not bridge the distance between Indiana and whatever town she calls home. It does not supply me with her name. But it relieves me of the final silence. I was born in 1851 in a frame house on a farm in Vigo County. I lived through war and loss and invention. I worked the soil. I buried my dead. I loved my husband faithfully. I carried a secret for more than 4 decades. And in April of 1868, I held a dark-haired infant girl for 2 hours and surrendered her to a future I would never see. I have not been entirely without her since. That is the full account as I can render it. My throat has grown dry with the speaking. If someone would be so kind, I would be grateful for a glass of water.